Hi, I'm Raymond Simonson. I'm the CEO of JW3, London's Jewish Community Centre and the UK's only Jewish arts and culture venue of its kind. Sadly, as you know, we've had to temporarily close our doors at the moment. We've got to think about people's health and safety, and we're listening to government advice. But just because we've stopped doing what we normally do in the way that we do it, it doesn't mean we have to completely stop what we're doing and what we're best at. And that is to increase the quality, variety, and volume of Jewish conversation in London and beyond. So we've got some treats for you. We are going to put on a whole load of our digital archive that we've been building up over the last 6 years of some amazing events. We're going to make them absolutely free of charge to you. And whilst you sit down with a cup of tea and put your feet up and watch this amazing thing you're about to see now, our team are going to be planning for a whole bunch of events that we're going to put on digitally over the coming months. For now, this one's on us, it's free. But you know, everything that we do costs money. And at the moment, we don't have the same income streams that we've got. So if you can spare a few pennies, a few shekels, if you can click donate online, that'll be really wonderful. We'd be so grateful for it. If you can do that, that's great. But either way, please sit back and enjoy. We'll see you again soon.
Thank you for joining us. We were wondering when we set this up to be on third day Yom Tov, whether people would have been so sick of seeing all their fellow Jews that they might have all hidden for a few days and not come to a Jewish community centre to talk about Jewish topics. But it's good. We can't promise you the same kiddush that you've had, but the conversation will be enlightening. So my name is Raymond Simonson. I'm the CEO of JW3. Can you hear me okay? I'm just nursing a slight sore throat. I won't cough or breathe on any of you, I promise. And it's a real delight to sit here with a long-term friend and colleague, Dr. Jonathan Boyd. John, who I've known for many years, we've worked together in many projects across the community. And we're really fortunate in this community. For those of you, are there people here that haven't come across JPR before? Okay, so some of you haven't come across JPR. We're really fortunate in this community. It's something that I think professionals like me in the community probably take for granted a little bit, that we have it. And then when I talk to professionals from other communities and other faith groups, and it comes up about JPR, they're amazed each time that we have something like this. The fact that we're able to run an event like this with expertise based on collecting and analysing the data of our community is something we are very fortunate to have in our community. And what I'm hoping is this will become an annual event that we'll run but somewhere between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, when you all, I'm sure, like I am, have been sitting there doing our own data, tallying up that which we have done, which we're proud of over the last year, that which we've done, which we're not so proud of, and thinking about what that tells us about what we're going to do about the year ahead. And now we're going to look at that on a more macro level. So I'm going to let John introduce himself and take you away. Just in terms of the format, we're going to focus on 3 of the 1,000 topics we could focus on. We're going to focus on 3 topics. John will present some of the latest data and analysis. He's the brains here. I'm just trying to hold it together. He'll present that. We'll have a brief conversation about it, and then we'll open it up for questions. And unusually, we're not going to say, please keep it to a question. Usually at this point, my job is to say no statements. If you want to respond to something John said and it's a thought rather than a question, that's also okay. If you have a counterpoint, if you see the data and your view of it is quite different, even though he'll be right and you'll be wrong, you are more than welcome. I can say that, he's not allowed to. You're more than welcome to posit that and we'll try and respond. And then we'll move, I'm going to keep tight to time and we'll move on, so we want to get through all 3 of our topics. Is that okay? We understand the rules of the game? Okay, so John, over to you.
Thank you. I'm going to stand up. First of all, thank you, Raymond, and thank you to JW3 for hosting this event. It's really great to be here, and it's lovely to see so many people here. He mentioned the fact that we're going to talk about 3 different themes. These are them. The first theme I want to talk about is insularity. I'll explain that in a moment. The second one is anxiety, and the third is continuity. insularity, anxiety, continuity, and then we can have a cup of tea if you want at the end of that. So for the next 25 minutes or so, I'm going to focus on the first of these, and we'll have a chat about that. And that's about this theme of insularity. So it's just a little bit of contextual stuff, I guess, to begin with. We have an extraordinary advantage in this community when we do research on British Jews, because in the national census, there is a religion question, and there has been both in 2001 and 2011. The census happens every 10 years. There'll be another one in 2021. And that gives us a fantastic data set, a whole load of data about Jews. And what we found in 2001 is that there were 266,000 Jews in the United Kingdom who ticked the box. 10 years later, in 2011, that figure had risen very slightly to 271,259. That's not all Jews in the country. Some people choose not to identify themselves, but it's certainly most of them. So that might be a little bit surprising to people that the number has increased slightly, but I think the best way to understand it, really, given the size of this data set, is really what we're seeing is a picture of stability in terms of the Jewish population over that 10-year period. The numbers basically are more or less the same. But that national picture disguises some of what's going on at a local level. These are data where we look at the Jewish population in different local authority districts, or boroughs, if you like. You can see them listed there down on the left-hand side. It's just a selection of them, it's not all of them. And then the second column, you can see how many Jews said they were living in each of those areas in 2011. In the next column to the right, how many were living there in 2001. The next column is, did the number between 2001 and 2011 increase or decrease? And in the right-hand column, what was the proportionate increase or decrease in each of those places over time? So if you want to read the top line, most Jews, the largest Jewish populations in Borough of Barnet, there were 54,000 living there in 2011, 46,000 in 2001. That's an increase of over 7,000 over that 10-year period, and it's a roughly 16% increase. Okay, so that's basically what the data show. But I said that the general picture is one of stability in the country in terms of the population. But there are certain places where we see the Jewish population has increased over that 10-year period. In Barnet, I've already mentioned, also in Hertsmere, think places like Elstree, Boreham Wood, Radlett. In Bury and Salford in Manchester, we see quite significant increase, particularly in Salford. And the other place that's perhaps worthy of note is St Albans, even though the numbers are small, quite significant increase over that 10-year period. St Albans, of course, being very close to Hertsmere. And at the same time, there are also a number of places geographically where we see Jewish population decline. Interestingly, some of these are in London, in Harrow, that's where Stanmore, for example, is, in Redbridge in the east of London, in Enfield and Brent, all boroughs of London, we see Jewish population decline between sort of 20 to 30%. And also looking outside of London, again, these are a few examples, but in Leeds, in Brighton, in Liverpool, quite significant Jewish population decline in those places. So that's just some general geographical data. Even though the overarching picture is stability, when we look at it at a geographical level, there are certain places where the Jewish population is growing and other places where it's declining. But I want to focus on some of the places where we see Jewish population growth, or most striking Jewish population growth. And these are, for me, the most important ones. Borough of Barnet, Hackney, think Stamford Hill, Bury and Salford in Manchester, Haringey right next to Hackney, and Gateshead in the northeast by Newcastle. And what do we know about all of these places? Probably don't need to tell you, but these are all either areas where the majority of Jews are Haredi, are strictly Orthodox, or where there's a significant strictly Orthodox Jewish population. And in the country, where the places where we see the most striking growth is in places where the strictly Orthodox live. When we cut the census data by strictly Orthodox and everybody else, and here, this is, I can explain that a little bit, how we did this later. But what we see is, amongst the strictly Orthodox population, over the course of that 10-year period, we saw an annual growth rate of 4.8%. in the mainstream population, looking again like on the right-hand column, we saw a slight decline of about 0.3%, 0.28%. Now, just to explain the 4.8% growth rate of the strictly Orthodox, if I was to present that figure at a conference of demographers and say this is a population that lives in the Western world at the beginning of the 21st century, they either wouldn't believe me or their jaw would hit the floor, because that is staggering growth. It basically means that the Haredi population is roughly doubling every 20 years or so, possibly even faster than that. This is fertility rates. Little lesson on fertility rates. The dotted red line there represents replacement level fertility. What does replacement level fertility mean? It means that if for a population to remain stable over time, every woman in that population has to have 2.1 children on average. I know it's difficult to have 0.1 of a child, but you get the idea. On average, right? So what's happening in the Jewish population, that's the purple lines here. In the strictly Orthodox population, the average number of children strictly Orthodox women are having is somewhere between 6 and 7. There are different measures. Here it says 7, but roughly around that mark. In the mainstream Jewish population, so the fourth line down here, it's below replacement level fertility, right? But when you put the two figures together, the total Jewish population is above that critical point. And that's part of the reason why we would expect the Jewish population to grow over time, by the way, in this country. But what it means, to cut a very long story short, is what's happening demographically in this community is a shift in balance over time. So putting aside the possibility of people moving into Jews moving into Britain or leaving Britain, and focusing just on the demographic data that I've talked about, what's happening, if those trends continue, is we're going to see a shifting balance, where at the moment the majority of Jews are not Haredi, but over time, and certainly by the end of this century, the majority will be Haredi. At the moment it's about 20% Haredi, but over time that will shift if demographic trends remain stable. That's the demographic picture. This is data on Jewish schools. And what it traces is the number of Jewish kids in Jewish schools from the mid-1950s up to today. I don't really need to explain this to you. The number's gone up, right, over time, from about 5,000 to about 35,000 today. It's a 7-fold increase over the course of 7 years. More and more Jewish kids are being educated in Jewish schools. It's not just the number, by the way, it's the proportion as well. So if you focus on the left-hand chart, these are the proportion of Jewish kids in Jewish schools. In blue, the mid-1990s, in orange, the mid-noughties, and in grey, kind of the most recent data we have. And the picture is, if you look at the total, it's gone from 38% to 55% to 63%. In the strictly Orthodox sector on the right, well, all kids go to Haredi schools, so that's basically been at a steady 100% over the time. But it's also happened within the mainstream non-Haredi Jewish sector as well. We've seen an increase from about a quarter to approaching half of all Jewish kids are in Jewish schools. We are choosing to educate our children more and more in an exclusively Jewish environment. When Jewish kids leave school and go to university, we see this. This is from a study we did in 2011. We built a sort of a big sample of about 1,000 Jewish students in that survey. And what we found is that about a quarter of all of those students are studying in just 3 universities. This is in 2011. Leeds, Birmingham, Nottingham. And if we add Manchester, Cambridge, Oxford, University, UCL and King's, we've got basically half of the Jewish student population. There are as many Jews studying in each of these, in the top left box in Leeds, Birmingham, Nottingham, as there are in the bottom right box in all of those universities put together. So when young people get the choice where to go, they're still choosing to cluster together in educational institutions. There's also some interesting geographical clustering going on, generally in the Jewish population. This is how many Jews live in different countries in Europe. The largest Jewish population is France, but the UK follows fairly close afterwards. It's about 290, maybe 300,000 Jews in the UK. There are more Jews here living in the UK than there are in Russia and Germany and Ukraine and Hungary and Netherlands, etc. But if we plot how many Jews there are living in London and the surrounding areas, this includes kind of South Hertfordshire, there are more Jews living in London than there are in the whole of Russia, Germany, Ukraine, Hungary, right? So we are concentrated in London. When we look at where Jews could, in theory, live across the UK, there is a very high concentration of Jews in London. And if we go in a little bit more detail and just focus on northwest London, right, there are about 140,000 Jews living in northwest London. So here's a map of London. And the area that I've shaded there is basically from St John's Wood, Swiss Cottage, up the Finchley Road, up the Edgware Road, right past here, through Golders Green, Hendon, Finchley, Mill Hill, out to Edgware, and then into South Hertfordshire, Radlett, Bushey, etc. And there are more Jews living in that small part of London than there are, again, in the whole of Germany, in the whole of Ukraine, in the whole of Hungary, Netherlands, etc. So geographically, we're also very concentrated. So why do I use this image? What I see happening is, religiously, we are closing in. We are becoming more insular because of the dynamics in the Haredi community. Educationally, we're closing in because we're just choosing to send our children more and more to Jewish schools. And geographically, we are clustering more and more in certain geographical areas. Now, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, we can talk about that. But it does seem to me that, the image of a flower can open up and take in the sunlight from all sorts of parts of society, I guess. But what seems to be happening in the Jewish world is a sort of a closing in, a more inward-looking focus. So that's insularity.
So we're going to have a little chat. You're allowed to listen in. And then I'm going to ask you a question, actually, before you ask us a question. So just the first thing that struck me when presenting this. So John and his team present this kind of data to community leaders and funders and to the people behind this project, behind JW3. We opened 6 years ago, 6 years and 2 days ago, but 5-7 years before that, we came and said, what data do we need to know? And when you present this kind of data at the moment, what kind of reaction or what's the range of reactions you're getting from, and I'm talking about from community leaders, not just from members of the public?
So it's really interesting, different reactions from different parts of the community. So there's one reaction which is absolute delight about it. We're clustering together. The Orthodox or Haredi Judaism seems to be winning out. So there's a sense, I think, from a certain part of the community, this is good news. There's a bit of pushback on the word insularity sometimes, where people sort of feel like actually that's the wrong term to use. And I'm happy to talk about that. And then there's a reaction of many, which I think is like a deep sense of concern actually about the trend and what we're seeing. In the education sector, I think there's been a very strong attempt to address concerns about Jewish continuity and intermarriage and Jewish communal engagement. So the fact that more kids are going to Jewish schools is seen as a very positive thing. But then I think there's also a counter argument to that, which is the more we do that, the less contact we have with our kids have with the non-Jewish world, and is that problematic? And the more less contact the non-Jewish world has with us as well.
And that's definitely something that jumps out to me with these kind of stats. Whenever I read statistics about the huge growth, if we're talking about 43% of non-Haredi Jewish kids now go to a Jewish school, unthinkable when I was going to school, which was in Redbridge. So I'm one of the minus numbers, I can only apologise. Yeah. Just unthinkable that many people, that my peers who largely send their children to Jewish primary and secondary schools, But what's now happening is some of these conversations that, and I'm saying partly anecdotally, both as a professional but as a parent. So I have one child in a Jewish primary school and a child who's just left a Jewish primary school. Now, I've spent my whole career working in the Jewish community in the field of Jewish education. So it was a bit of a shock to some of my communal friends when they assumed we'd send our kid to a Jewish school. And we made the decision after lots of discussion and thought to go to a Jewish primary school, then non-Jewish secondary school. Because of this issue that you raised, where we see more and more teenagers, more and more Jewish teenagers, who can go through from the age of 5 or 6 to the age of 18, 19, never really having met a non-Jew, never really having had an encounter other than a transactional one in a shop, never had a meaningful friendship or conversation with a non-Jew. And there's a concern that I start hearing it around Shabbat tables at the moment, insular is that word. Are we closing in? Are we going to see, when we do research in 10 years and 15 and 20 years' time, that fewer and fewer Jewish young people meet non-Jews, and conversely, that more non-Jews are just not meeting Jewish people and having those encounters? Is that something that this kind of data should trouble people like me who have that sensibility?
Yeah, I think it should. I mean, I think there's a real concern that certainly within the educational system that's what's happening. It's happening geographically as well. You know, if you see the sort of the decline of Jewish populations in places like Liverpool and Birmingham and Leeds and Glasgow and Hull and Sunderland, where there were quite strong Jewish communities, if there are no Jews left or very few Jews left, then yeah, absolutely non-Jews are just interacting with Jews less. And that doesn't seem to me to be good for anybody. You know, on the other hand, you know, we have had real challenges and real concerns here about how to reinforce Jewish life, how to build Jewish life, and the importance of doing that in community and having a social group and having a sort of a strong Jewish community around you is kind of critical to it. So I think there's a balance that we need to strike, and I guess what I'm trying to raise here is, you know, given what we can see, have we got the balance right at the moment? Do we need to adjust? Do we need to respond in some way? And given what we can see happening over time.
So having a critical mass of Jews has always been an important part of having community. Mm-hmm. It's hard to have an exciting synagogue community without lots of Jews, or a Jewish youth group, or you know, it's hard to keep a kosher shop open when the numbers decline so much. So growing up in Redbridge, growing up in Gad's Hill in the 70s and 80s, there was one, if not two, kosher restaurants, lots of different kosher shops. Now, one by one, they've pretty much all closed. Even some of the kosher bakeries are no longer kosher bakeries. They're Jewish bakeries, and they just know they don't have to have a Tudat Kashrut, have a kosher certificate anymore. So you see that kind of decline. I've noticed with interest at the moment, if any of you have followed in the pages of the Jewish press, one community outside of London where a philanthropist who grew up there, who incidentally doesn't live there anymore, is trying to do something. And whether it's going to work or not, it's going to be interesting to see. But Brighton, some of you followed what's going on in Brighton at the moment? You can just give a wave if you've kind of know what I'm talking about or interested. Okay, thanks, Mum. In Brighton, so Tony Bloom, the Bloom Foundation, owns Brighton and Hove Football Club, and saw where the synagogue was. You know, land is going to have to be sold off. It's the synagogue he grew up in, the synagogue he doesn't go to, if we use the old Jewish joke, and who's bought the land and has got planning permission. It's being contested at the moment, I believe, to build a Jewish community around the synagogue. And what's most interesting, and I think going to be fascinating to see over the coming years, is their real ambition is to get Jews coming back to Brighton. So it's not just about building something. We built something here without an assumption that people will suddenly flock to the area. I've always been interested to see that might be a side effect. But they're doing something intentionally, not just for the Jews that are in the community, but to say in 10 years' time, when we look at those figures, they want to see that the Brighton Jewish community has grown because of the facility. Now, I'm not aware of many projects like that, but that'll be a fascinating thing to watch over the coming years, right?
Yeah, it will be. I mean, I think it's an incredibly difficult thing to do, particularly when fighting demography is a little bit of a fool's game sometimes. And in Brighton, what we can see happening is, as the data showed, a sort of a 20% decline in the Jewish population there over that 10-year period. On the other hand, Brighton's kind of interesting because it's right by Sussex University. So there is scope, I think, to pull in young people, and maybe some people will stay. And Brighton also has a sort of an edgy culture to it. So it's not beyond the realms of possibility that something will happen there, but it's tough. It's really, really tough to fight demography.
It's exciting to see, an ambitious project trying to do something, because we don't often see, apart from really, really localised projects, we don't see in this country, in this kind of dwelling community, as much as say in the States, where new things open up all the time. And in London, just if you live in the kind of northwest London, most people here do. Okay, so you see different initiatives and projects, and I won't say organisations necessarily, in the last few years opening up more and more than I remember, whether it's the Grassroots Jews initiatives and Moishe House, and they mostly are London and mostly northwest London. So a few in Hackney and a few, but they're mostly around here, because there are the numbers to start with, so it's a kind of chicken and egg, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So let me ask a question. If we can get some light on the audience, and then I'll give you a chance to ask a question. I just wanted to ask if there was anything that you saw in this first third of the evening that particularly surprised you or concerned you. Anything that you weren't expecting to see? Was there anything someone saw? You don't have to even comment on it. Just curious. Anything you saw of the figures, or was it all just obvious to you? The gentleman over here, you've got two people with microphones that are going to help you so you can be heard.
As a Jew brought up in South London, I find it very concerning about the number of Jews going to Jewish schools, because that's resulted in the closing of many cheder. And it means that ordinary mainstream Jews are not getting a Jewish education at all. And I wonder, what happens is, in a shul where there used to be a cheder, and there isn't a cheder anymore, people don't belong to the shul anymore, because people used to belong to the shul because they wanted their children to have at least an education up to bar mitzvah.
Yeah, there's no question that the growth of the Jewish school sector has had an impact on the cheder system. We see synagogue membership levels declining for all sorts of reasons. Partly because Jewish populations are ageing in certain places, and they're just declining by natural forces. But there is undoubtedly an impact of the school sector on the cheder sector. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Educationally, I think we can discuss, but certainly it's having an impact on synagogue membership figures. Yeah.
And certainly we'll come back to education and Jewish identity in the third part. Andrew, sorry, there's a gentleman over here, and then we'll go behind you. So let's just take a couple more on these.
The thing that gives most disquiet is that when I hear people talk on this, it's focused on those who are in Jewish schools rather than those who are not in Jewish schools. And I'm glad to hear that Moss is going somewhere else. It's when you look, it's not just the cheder, it's the fact of what effect on youth groups, what effect on also on used to be all these school assemblies in non-Jewish schools that would have many, many people, and therefore the strength of those people has all gone from those places, and you've therefore got a sort of, everyone's talking about the haves, and those people who are given lots and everything, all the investment by all the Jewish charities is in the haves, but those people who are outside, you use Jewish schools, but in other senses, if you're outside these core areas, it's not, the investment's not on you, everyone is focusing on the haves, and letting them, therefore, these have-nots are being sort of written off by the Jewish community as well, maybe.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, I should just say, I'm conducting my own little experiment with my kids at home. I've got twins, one of them's in a Jewish secondary school and one isn't. So we'll see what happens with it.
This is what happens when one of your parents is a social scientist. You become an experiment. Yes, that's what happens.
That's just the way it is, I'm afraid. But I would add that I think there's a kind of core assumption that exists that sending your child to a Jewish school is a good thing for their Jewish identity. I can see with my son who's in a non-Jewish school, and I know from my own experience because I didn't go to Jewish school, that the interaction as a Jewish student with non-Jews can be quite a sort of a powerful one in terms of trying to understand your own identity and how you fit into wider society. And I'm not sure that in the course of building the Jewish educational institutions that we built over the course, particularly over the course of the last generation or so, we've really fully understood that. It seems to me to be an important piece of the jigsaw puzzle that we need to understand better, for all the strengths, I would say, of that Jewish schools bring as well.
I think just one thing to add to that. If we're looking at the importance of data, and again, I'm not the spokesperson for JPR, then you've highlighted a great example of, if the data tells us this, what do we as a community, the leadership of the community, the people who hold the purse strings of the community, need to do about it? Where are the conversations happening? And I'm not suggesting they're not happening. Where are the conversations happening and who's involved in them that talks about the 57% of Jewish children, of non-Haredi Jewish children, who are not in Jewish school? And the investment in, we'll come on to that maybe later on in this, where else that money might be invested in. But thank you for that. I want to move on in a minute, so I'm going to just take two more. There are lots of you. There's a gentleman here with his hand up with the blue shirt, and a gentleman here with his hand up. Who's going to go next?
Shirt cover there, thank you. Thanks for the talk, John. It's very interesting. Looking forward to the rest of it. Could you just...
That was the best bit.
That was the best. Oh, I'm going. It's peaked. I'm going to stop again. I'm definitely going to go. Could you just unpack a little bit this idea of mainstream Judaism from this point of view? Because being part of the community lead in progressive Judaism, we're not seeing that. We're seeing a growth of our communities out of the metropolis, and actually an enriching of Jewish life in many places, which have been fairly sparsely served up to now. So is there another narrative which needs to be brought out, looking at that bigger picture of mainstream Judaism?
Okay, shall I do that one?
Yeah, go ahead.
So the way, just to explain the way we cut these data is because the census data are, they're really extraordinary, and they allow us to sort of drill down to a very, very, very small geographical areas. So in trying to identify who is strictly Orthodox and who isn't, we focused in on those geographical areas where we know either everybody or the vast, vast majority of Jews are strictly Orthodox, and then we looked at everybody else who is not. So by mainstream, we're really talking about anybody who is modern Orthodox to completely secular. And that's how we cut those data. So when we put, that's what I mean by mainstream, for want of a better term. There are differences by denomination. We see that in some of the synagogue membership figures, and we see it in some of the geographical data. And there are certainly communities dotted around the country that are more successful than others for various reasons. But I think often. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but there's often a perception when one looks at their own community that sort of extraordinary things are happening, and there's vibrancy and there's dynamism. When you actually look at the numbers, it's rarely such a great picture. Certainly when you get outside of London, and certainly when you get outside of the Haredi community outside of London. So yes, there are pockets of vibrancy, but understanding really what's happening in demographic, numerical terms, it's remarkably rare to see a positive picture, although I accept there are some exceptions. Yeah.
And essentially, and I forget the term with the dotted line, but if we have more Jews dying than are being born, if the birth rate isn't catching up with the death rate, I'm not a social scientist.
No, it's a basic demographic rule. If more Jews are dying than being born, the population will decline. If more are being born than are dying, the population will grow. It's a little bit more complicated than that because there's migration you have to bear in mind as well. But generally, the picture outside of those core pockets, like parts of northwest London, parts of Salford, Bury, Manchester, Gateshead, generally, what's driving Jewish population decline is predominantly demographic factors, an ageing population not replacing itself, plus to a certain degree migration from those centres into kind of the more densely populated areas.
I'm going to take this gentleman because I said I would, and then we will move on to the next topic.
That was really fascinating. It was based on insularity, but I wondered about the very high intermarriage rates, which I thought had been increasing, and which would precisely point in the other direction from insularity. What you could say about that?
Yeah, well, so, I mean, interestingly, the intermarriage rate in this country is around 26% at the moment. You compare that with the States, in the States it's over 50%. So when we contrast the Jewish community here with other similar communities around the world, the intermarriage rate is actually pretty low. But part of the reason why it's so low collectively is because of the Haredi factor and the Orthodox factor, where intermarriage is rare. So yeah, I mean, we live in a society where only kind of 0.5% of the total population, and given that reality, you'd expect, all things being equal, the intermarriage rate to be incredibly high. But it's not. And part of the reason it's not, by the way, is because we cluster together and we build all sorts of kind of Jewish institutions, and we cluster geographically, and we go to Jewish schools, and we invest in the community so that Jewish kids are meeting other Jewish kids, and over time are likely to marry each other as a result. So it's a combination of that Orthodox factor plus the way we've structured our community that's keeping the intermarriage level down, actually.
Thank you. We are going to move on, because I'm conscious of time, so we're going to go on to from insularity to anxiety, just to cheer us up.
Cool, let's get anxious. Okay. Right, anxiety. So I want to talk about anti-Semitism because I'm not sure there's any way to do a talk about contemporary British Jewry without talking about it. But I want to focus really my thoughts on levels of anxiety in the community. So in the last few years, we've conducted 2 surveys for the European Union of Jews across Europe. And these are, one was in 2013, the second one was last year, and these are data on Jews from the UK, talking about life in the UK. The figures, the bars in grey are data from 2013, the bars in red are from 2018. So the question at the top is the same one. Do you think anti-Semitism in the UK is a very big problem, a fairly big problem, not a particularly big problem, not a problem at all? What did we find in 2013? 48% of Jews in the UK said they thought it was either a very big or a fairly big problem. The equivalent figure when we asked the question in 2018 was 75%, significant jump. Second question was, in the last 5 years, do you think anti-Semitism has increased a lot, increased a little, not increased very much, not increased at all? Figure for 2013, people saying they felt it increased, either a little or a lot, was 66%. By 2018, that had jumped to 88%. Clear shift in the number and the proportion of Jews saying they think anti-Semitism is a problem, and anti-Semitism levels have increased in this country. This is a data on, are Jews considering emigrating from this country as a result of anti-Semitism, fears of anti-Semitism. So it's a question specifically about, are you thinking about emigrating because of anti-Semitism? These are data for various different countries, but I want to focus on the UK, which is in the box. We found in 2018 that 29% of Jews said they had considered over the previous 5 years of emigrating from Britain because of anti-Semitism. The equivalent figure in brackets for 2013 was 18%. Again, an increase in the number of people thinking in that way. Still a minority, by the way. Most Jews have not considered it, but close to 1 in 3 now say they have considered it. These are Community Security Trust data about anti-Semitic incidents. How many incidents they've recorded in every year from 2007 up to 2019. I've sort of projected the figures for 2019, and we've got data for the first 6 months, so this is my estimate of what I think they're going to come up with at the end of this year for the figures for 2019. The important thing I think to focus on is the last few years, and these are, I think, particularly important data because they always generate significant headlines. And what have those headlines been in the last few years? They have consistently been the number of incidents that are being recorded or reported is higher this year than it was last year, and moreover, that the number in the last few years is the highest ever. These are the highest levels we have ever seen. So all of that is part of what we're seeing, and I think part of what's driving a level of degree of anxiety in the Jewish population. But I want to just cast these data in a different way, exactly the same data, and I feel a bit like, you know, that bit in Crime Watch at the end of every episode of Crime Watch where they say, "Don't worry, everything's okay." You know, these things are very rare. So let me show you this chart. These are exactly the same data, but just cast in a slightly different way. This is for every 1,000 Jews in the population of the UK, how many have reported an incident to the CST that they've recorded every year from 2007 to 2019. So this is how many in every 1,000 Jews over the course of any given year. And the figures have increased, obviously, but they're in the range of sort of 2 to 6 people in every 1,000. That means that between 994 and 998 in every 1,000 are not experiencing an incident, or if they are experiencing an incident, they're not reporting it to the CST. So just to kind of give a little bit of context about this. And interestingly, in the data I mentioned before, the data we'd gathered for the European Union in 2013 and 2018, if you focus here on these are different countries, and the question here is, how are you either very or fairly worried about the possibility of an anti-Semitic attack, whether that's a physical attack in orange or a verbal insults and harassment in blue? The figures for UK, which are sort of towards the right there, are 29% say they're either very or fairly worried about verbal insults or harassment, and 20% say they're very or fairly worried about a physical attack. But what's interesting is the white numbers in the bars at the bottom, because those are the equivalent figures that we got in 2013. And they are, to all intents and purposes, the same. They're within a margin of error. So, you know, there's possibly been a slight increase. But we don't see particularly an increase in anxiety about the possibility or worry about attacks or harassment. That doesn't seem to be the piece that's driving the increase in anxiety. Moreover, these are migration data. These are actually Aliyah data, like how many Jews migrate from, in this case, France in blue and the UK in red every year since 1995 up to 2018. How many Jews have migrated to Israel? By the way, the most common destination for Jews to migrate to is Israel, of all countries. So I think they do capture something. First, you'd expect levels to be higher in France and the UK simply because the French Jewish population is bigger than the British Jewish population. So, you know, put that aside. But one of the things we've seen in France is this very dramatic spike in the last few years, which has kind of normalised actually in recent years. But that's very much in response to some of the terrorist attacks that happened in Paris and Toulouse, etc. The picture in the UK is completely stable and low. It's about 500, it's 484 Jews per annum make Aliyah. And there's been no discernible shift at all in the actual number of Jews making Aliyah over the last few years. So we see an increase in people thinking about it, but we don't see an increase in people doing it yet. Maybe that'll change, but we don't see it, but certainly haven't seen it up to now. So the question is, like, what is driving the anxiety? Apologies for this chart, I know it looks horrendous, but these are asking Jews, again in different countries, Austria, Belgium, Germany, Denmark, Spain, France, Hungary, Italy, Netherlands, Poland, Sweden, the UK, where they think anti-Semitism is most a problem. And we've got data here for online, in political life, in the media, on the street. And I want to focus particularly on politics, because I'm really struck by this. A higher proportion of Jews in the UK say anti-Semitism is a problem in British politics than in any other country in Europe. Higher than Hungary, Orban's Hungary, higher than Poland, Kaczynski's Poland, where all sorts of, if you've been following, all sorts of stuff been going on there. And also, strikingly, I don't show this on the chart, but that's 84% of Jews in the UK in 2018 said they thought anti-Semitism was a problem in politics. The equivalent figure for 2013 was 34%. So a really, really dramatic increase. And the only explanation for that is the Corbyn factor. The other thing I would highlight in this chart is that in every single country, the environment or the context in which people perceive anti-Semitism to be the biggest problem is online, and particularly in social media. Every single country, that's where we see the highest counts. There's something going on, therefore, in political life and in and online and social media that is driving, I think, the anxiety. And I just want to finish by showing you this, because these are again going back to CST data on the number of anti-Semitic incidents that they record each year. But what I've done here is charted from 2011, which is the first time they even report on this, up to 2019 projected. How many of the incidents that they report are social media related? And what we see is that in 2011 it was 12, and then it climbs pretty steadily. There are ups and downs. But by 2019, it's projected to hit 646. So far more incidents are happening online than were. And the orange line looks at the proportion of all the incidents that they record that are social media related. So in 2011, it was 2%, 1 in 50. By this year, I'm expecting them to come up with a figure of around 36%, 1 in 3. So there is clearly something going on, and you see it very clearly in these data, around the social media environment. So my image for this section is a panic button. And I suppose my question is, and I don't have a clear or coherent answer to it, to be honest, is how worried should we be? At what point does one hit the panic button on anti-Semitism? It's clearly being driven by the political environment. It's clearly being informed by what's happening on social media. It doesn't seem to be being informed particularly by concern about harassment or violence. But we are becoming increasingly anxious. How do we make sense of that? And how do we know when to hit the panic button? Are we doing that too soon? What happens if we hit it too late? Etc.
So one of the things that jumps out to me as being so interesting is there's a growth, and tell me if I've got this wrong, an increase in the anxiety, a concern about this thing called anti-Semitism, sort of in theory, but not necessarily an increase in the concern of I'm going to be a victim of an anti-Semitic attack.
Mm-hmm.
Now that feels instinctively to me like a, not cognitive dissonance, but it doesn't sit comfortably with me.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm trying to avoid the word project fear. But that thing of if something is repeated a lot and we're told about it a lot, we start fearing it, even if it hasn't really happened to us or we haven't experienced it. Is that part of what we're seeing here?
I think so. I don't want to dismiss the number of people who have experienced anti-Semitic harassment or violence. Or violence is actually incredibly rare. Most of the incidents that the CSD record are incidents of harassment. I don't want to dismiss that because those are real people, those are real incidents, and they can be deeply troubling. But I suppose the question is, as I said, it's like, to what extent is the whole conversation about anti-Semitism being shaped by the environment in which we live, whether it's the sort of the political environment or the social media environment, and how real is that? How extensive is it? I'm just not sure we have a clear enough understanding of all of that. And I don't want to dismiss people's anxieties about it. I think there has been a shift in the nature of what's going on around anti-Semitism, and the situation is worse today than it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago. No question about it whatsoever. But it's trying to make sense of what's really going on.
I also think where there's a shift now, and it's interesting when we're here focusing on the year ahead, right, and on the future, is it felt like once upon a time I was worried about anti-Semitism if I had seen it, if one of my friends had been attacked, as a youngster, as a teenager, as a student, if I'd heard it. If not, I probably wasn't thinking about it or talking about it. And now that feels like a real shift, a generational shift. that now that anti-Semitism is the topic I hear almost more than any other Jewish topic, including in, I always, this time of year I like to get people to compare what were the topics of the sermons, right, in synagogue, and how many rabbis mentioned or how many rabbis mentioned anti-Semitism. And I remember last year having that conversation. It was quite depressing. It was the topic that everyone was coming out and talking about. So it feels like that actually, just as a topic itself, it's there. And in that case, it can be as damaging to people's mental health, to their feeling of comfort and safety, as real anti-Semitic attacks. If I'm fearing there's this thing called anti-Semitism, the boogeyman, even if I've never experienced it, well, maybe that fear itself is already damaging. Does that feel like maybe that's something that's shifted?
I think so. So it's not so much that vast numbers of us are experiencing anti-Semitic incidents, or necessarily know people who have. It's more that there is this contextual environment that is shaping the conversation, driving up anxiety, increasing fear, and it's very difficult, I think, to really get your arms around how extensive is that? How threatening is it? How do we make sense of it? Because it's not, we're not living in Nazi Germany at all. This is, it's a very, very different reality. But there's this context that feels scary in a way that it didn't, and that shapes everything.
And I think for Jewish community leaders and also the Jewish press, I think there's a bit of a lose-lose situation, because you'll be criticised for not taking anti-Semitism situation seriously, and you'll be criticised for making it the front page news or the sermon topic or whatever.
Yes.
And I've done that experiment, because I'm sad like that, of looking at 52 copies of the front pages of the Jewish press for a year, and I can tell you that the 90-something%, I forget when I last looked, about 90% of the front pages are either Israel or anti-Semitism, and it's close to 50-50. Pretty much every week the front page will either be about, it depends what's happened. If Netanyahu said something, or if there's been an election, it's Israel. If not, it's anti-Semitism, and that becomes the topic that drives the conversations around the Shabbat tables and everywhere else. And I'm not suggesting in any way they become self-fulfilling, because if it's not there, it's not there. But we can't seem to win, right? We're going to criticise people for not mentioning it enough, or for mentioning it too much. Did anyone catch the Prime Minister's speech today? Right? He what did he call the party that had their what did he call the Labour Party? So the anti-Semitic Marxists, was that the term? I forget the term, but he used the term in his first major speech as Prime Minister, his first major speech as leader of the country and of the Tory party at conference. In a 45-minute speech, he straight away, and he didn't really have that many attacks on Corbyn Labour, but he certainly went for the anti-Semitism one straight away. So it's become mainstream conversation. I think one of the things that's just interesting that I know, and then we'll open it to you, is that the slide you showed that showed it in the last 4 or 5 years, it's quite easy to point to Corbyn's Labour as one of the things you'd see in the calendar, but also the huge growth of social media, in particular Twitter, but not only, and that from what I've seen, and correct me if you know better, but online hate crimes, Islamophobia in particular, also homophobia and misogyny online has gone to a different level than it ever was before. And is it perhaps that we are another ism that's caught up with all of that, and we're not so special from any other minority? Would that explain part of that rise?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the data that we have on hate crime generally, there's been an increase, certainly in the last 5 years, against all religious minorities, particularly Muslims. Most hate crimes are committed against Muslims, but that's partly because they're by far and away the largest religious minority in this country. So I think the latest figures, 2017-18, were about 52% of all hate crimes were against Muslims. But the second most common group are Jews, about 12%. And it's no surprise to me, really, that the increase in anti-Semitism has come at pretty well exactly the same time as the growth of social media. And thinking about JC headlines, in so many cases, the story is generated by something that happened on social media. And by the way, just thinking about social media generally, the whole issue of how we count one anti-Semitic incident has also become incredibly complicated as a result of social media. So, for example, the police stated at one point that Luciana Berger, MP, had experienced 2,500 incidents of hate in 3 days. Right, that's more than the CST counted for the entire Jewish population in a single year. So, what constitutes a single incident has also become complicated by just by the nature of social media. But I think there's a relationship between the increase in hate crime and the increase in anti-Semitism and the emergence of social media.
As I open up, I'm going to just point one interesting thing that John and I were talking about before, because it came out I think this week or last week in the JC, was about on those Aliyah figures. So I remember sitting around a table of other communal CEOs, I think it was 18 months ago, where they had given the headline of 1 in 5 Jews considering making Aliyah, we're all going to flee the country because of Corbyn and everything else. And it was something that a lot of us assumed was, one answers it as a question in a survey but isn't going to do it. What we see is that the recent report shows that for every 2 Jews that leave the UK for Israel, there are 3 Israeli Jews who are coming to the UK, which is either because they're not scared, either because they're harder than us, these Chalutnik fighting Jews, or because actually the fear is there, but not enough to propel Jews to leave.
They want to study here, they want to work here.
Right. And we've seen here the community of Jews that access this centre, of Israelis, that access centre, is, in terms of numbers, is way beyond anything we ever expected. Significant numbers and growing. As are the French Jewish community who obviously have left France for reasons we understand. Okay, let's open it up whilst we've got time. Mr. Glass at the back with the glasses, and is anyone over this side? I'm very conscious, I don't want to be one of those people, but I'm very conscious that we've mostly had men speaking so far. If there are any women that want to speak, this lady over here with the flower, the open flower on her top. So we're going to go over there first for Mr. Glass, and then this lady over here.
Thank you. I wanted to sort of start by reinforcing some negativity and then actually end on a positive. I find, obviously you have to work with the data you've got, but your sort of 600 odd anti-Semitic incidents online or total or whatever, I could show you within a week online. Labour Against Anti-Semitism as a group are reporting 50 Labour members a month for anti-Semitism. But that's never, or very rarely, one incident. These people are spreading their hate day after day, week after week, in hundreds, sometimes thousands of posts. So I completely understand why the fear is there, because anyone who's on social media will see it constantly. The real worry about social media, I think, and it's a word you haven't used, but it's certainly those of us heavily involved in fighting this day after day use, which is radicalisation. People who have never met a Jew, people who've never thought about a Jew, 3 or 4 years ago, you can look at their tweets, would never have come up, are now dedicating something between 50 and 90% of their time on being critical about Jews. And that is impacting on, I think, probably tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands of people. And the knock-on effect for our community over the next however many years, regardless of whether Corbyn becomes Prime Minister or not, is absolutely huge. Once that genie is out of the bottle, it's not going to go back in, I'm afraid. So let's end on a positive, which people never really think about. What anti-Semitism in the last few years has done to this country, to the Jews in this country, has boosted the identity of tens of thousands of Jews in this country. So not only people who, were generally proud Jews who come to JW3 and go to Finchley Reform or Kinloss or whatever, but people who had stopped identifying as Jews are now identifying as Jews in a positive way. And these are from very famous people that we see on TV all the time, a lot of journalists, even people like Peston, who in his entire career, I cannot remember a single time mentioning he was Jewish. In the last 2 or 3 years, over and over again, he's talking about how he's Jewish and how it impacts on him. But there's a whole load of national journalists where that's the case. But I think even normal people who Ray and I grew up with in Ilford, who, were very immersed in the community till they were 20, stopped, are now at the demos, are writing their letters, are doing whatever. So what I'm hoping is, along with the negatives, is that actually there's the positive side as well.
Yeah. I don't want to be misunderstood here. It's very clear to me that there is something disturbing going on in the political arena, online, social media, and there's no question at all, and I think the data show this, that people are increasingly anxious about it, justifiably so. Like, those things are worrying. But I suppose the question I'm trying to pose is how we don't. I struggle as someone who writes about this stuff and researches it to figure out how do I read these data and what do I say to people? I don't want to panic people, unreasonably or illegitimately. On the other hand, I want to be honest about what I can see, it's very, very difficult at the moment, I think, to interpret a lot of what's going on. Which is why I think I posed the question, like, how worried should we be? I don't know whether people have read the book by Alan Eisner, The Prince of West End Avenue, but it's a book that has haunted me for many, many years, because it's I'm going to ruin it for anyone who hasn't read it now. But it's basically the ending of the story is that the main author, I guess, the main subject of the story, turns out he was a journalist in Germany in the 1930s and was constantly telling people to calm down, it'll be okay. And then for the rest of his life has to live with the consequences of that. I'm very conscious of that. At the same time, I don't want to generate unnecessary panic. What I'm saying, I think, fundamentally, is it's just very, very difficult to really interpret what's going on at the moment and figure out to what extent are those tweets representative of a significant proportion, or to what extent is it just a relatively small group of people. In terms of the impact that this stuff has on people's Jewishness, there's certainly that phenomenon going on. But I think the unseen other side of that equation are Jews who say, you know what, if this stuff is going on, I actually don't want to have anything to do with it, and I'm disappearing. And we don't see that because they're disappearing. And in future, it's actually an important research question for us, and we will be looking at it in future years, because I think it's a really important piece of the jigsaw puzzle. Anti-Semitism both encourages people to cluster together in search of solidarity, but it also repels people.
And my concern, based on experience, 20 odd years working in informal Jewish education, is that things like that are quite good for gathering people in a moment. But my experience, and I don't have the data, and I'd love to see if this becomes a piece of research, it's not a great piece for the long-lasting, they're not great building blocks for long-lasting positive Jewish identity. And we've seen that with the old-fashioned style of education, the way that some educators in the 80s used Holocaust education and anti-Semitism as a way to grow positive Jewish identity. It kind of failed. I think it failed miserably, because it didn't give people the positives to hang on to when there wasn't the cases of anti-Semitism. And please God, what we're experiencing now is not going to be the next 10, 20, 30 years, even if it's the next few years. So what will those people whose identities maybe have reawakened, what will they grasp onto when there isn't a fight against anti-Semitism? And that's something that would worry me. But we're going to come on to soon, we're going to come back to your question, and then we will move on to the topic of Jewish identity and continuity. So it'll be a good segue in. So yes, please. You've waited so patiently, thank you.
My concern is for the children who go to university and coming to this country. When we arrived here some 23 years ago, everyone was very quiet about being Jewish. And I am very worried about how our students at university can stand up and be proud Jews. And I do believe the British Jews have it in them to stamp this out without question.
I mean, I would agree, and actually, I think one of the things that's very striking about what's happened in this community over the last few years around the anti-Semitism crisis is that I think we've been far more loud and out there than certainly we would have been a generation or two ago. In fact, when I think back, the community, like organisations like the Board of Deputies, were always criticised for being kind of, head down, collar up, don't rock the boat. And that's really doesn't characterise the community at all. On students, I would just say very briefly that in the research that we've done on Jewish students, there's a quantitative study that I referred to earlier, but there's also a qualitative study more recently. The students who are experiencing anti-Semitism, on the whole, are those who engage in student politics, particularly around Israel. Those are the ones that really encounter it and have really horrible experiences. For those who don't really get involved in that, on a day-to-day level, and there are some like pretty disturbing exceptions to this, but on a day-to-day level, they're not encountering it. But yeah, the question of how one, I actually think the community's been very good at providing examples of standing up to hate, and I would hope that Jewish students are learning from that.
Thank you. We're going to move from anxiety to continuity and see if there's any good news.
Okay, so this is I want to look at the question here. My image is of a relay race, and I guess the question is, how does one transmit Jewishness from one generation to the next? And I want to share the results of a piece of work we did a few years ago now, that I've continued to sort of think about and ponder in the period since, and we'll do more and more work on in the years to come. I want to start by saying we often talk about wanting to strengthen our Jewish identity, or our children's Jewish identity, or our grandchildren's identity. We want them to have stronger Jewish identities. But when we think about different types of Jews, what they mean by strengthening Jewish identity really varies. So in the top left-hand corner, I kind of think about a Seder table. And around my Seder table every year, there are a couple of rabbis. There's me, who's kind of, I guess, reasonably Jewishly involved and engaged. There are, cousins who kind of, might turn up from one year to the next, but might not even notice it's Pesach. There are members of the family who really engage in Pesach as on a sort of social justice level. It's all about the universal drive for freedom. The Jewish piece of it is kind of secondary. There are different types of Jews sitting around our Seder table. In the top middle picture, there are the Jews who understand their Jewishness as campaigning for social justice. So a strengthened Jewish identity, I guess, would mean stronger campaigns for social justice in general in society. There are, the types of Jews sometimes that we find at bar mitzvah parties, for whom, lifting the bar mitzvah boy or girl, bar mitzvah girl, up on a chair is kind of like one of the key things that you have to do. There's like this kind of nostalgic sense of Jewishness, even though there's, it's really just a sort of a cultural tradition. But there isn't always kind of the really sort of serious depth there. There's, the Haredi, or kind of strictly Orthodox crowd who, understand their Jewishness as being frum, being halakhically observant. To have a stronger Jewish identity is to be more frum or more halakhically observant. There are the kinds of Jews that we might find at a big Jewish charitable dinner who might understand their Jewish identity is about giving more to Jewish charities or non-Jewish charities or whatever it is, but it's about contributing money or volunteering their time. And then there are the types of Jews for whom, their Jewish identity is all about, and kind of talked about them before, combating anti-Semitism or perhaps supporting Israel or those sorts of things. So there are these different types of Jewishness, and when we think about, we want our children or our grandchildren to be more Jewish, we're sometimes talking about being more observant, sometimes we're talking about more concerned with social justice, sometimes about more about just turning up. There are different measures that we use. And we've done work on trying to understand Jewish identity. So when we do a survey of Jews. We measure Jewish identity in lots of different ways. We ask, for example, do you belong to a synagogue? We ask, have you been on an Jewish adult education program? We ask about what proportion of your friends, close friends, are Jewish. We ask, do you believe in God? How important is supporting Israel to your Jewish identity? How important is combating anti-Semitism? How important to what extent do you think Judaism is about ethical and moral behaviour? There are lots of different ways that we measure it. And what we have tried to do now in 2 big studies that we've done is use a statistical method called factor analysis, which I won't go into detail about, but basically what it does is it looks for patterns in a big data set. So if people do X, are they also likely to do Y and less likely to do Z? And in that way we can see sort of how Jewish identity or different versions of Jewish identity clustered together. And we've identified in the research we've done, and there may well be more than this, 6 different types, if you like, of Jewishness. The first is what I would call mindful observance, and that is about deep belief in God, deep commitment to halakha, Jewish learning, behaving Jewish, and really believing in it, believing in the sort of the religious and observant parts of it. That's one sort of form of Jewishness. Another form we can see is religious behaviour. So that is synagogue attendance, marking Shabbat, being part of an active Jewish social life, but not necessarily, in a sense, behaving Jewishly in all those sorts of ways, but not necessarily really believing it in a deep sort of, religious observant way. You turn up, you're very involved, you're engaged, but you're not necessarily believing in the way that person number 1 is. The third type of Jewish identity is what I've called cultural observance, and that is the type of Jewish identity that involves, like maybe fasting on Yom Kippur, or maybe turning up to the family Seder, but essentially doing that for cultural reasons. It's not about any sense of religious obligation. It's about, being part of the family. It's about doing these things because that's what Jews do, and I'm just, I'm marking my Jewish cultural identity in some way. The fourth one is what I've called here survivalist action, and that is supporting Israel, being engaged with combating anti-Semitism, and interesting, what also clusters with that is opposition to intermarriage. So it's a lot about trying to keep the tribe, if you like, together. It's very sort of tribalistic, it's very ethnocentric. It's about protecting us collectively. For the fifth one is social activity. It's sort of a Jewishness where your social life is full of other Jews. You hang out with other Jews. You might turn up to all sorts of Jewish social events and activities, but you don't necessarily need the organised community to do that. You do it on your own terms. You just, your friends are Jewish. You're making Jewish life for yourself, but you're not necessarily really engaged in Jewish communal life. And the last one is social justice, and that is things like volunteering for charities, supporting social justice causes, charitable giving, thinking that Judaism is about moral behaviour. There are these different kind of types of Jewishness. And our question in the research was, what types of interventions, educational programs, institutions, activities, shape or inform these different types of Jewishness, these 6 different types of Jewish identity? So, is it going to a Jewish school, for example, on the bottom left, or going on a summer tour to Israel or a gap year program to Israel in the middle, participating in a summer camp or being involved in the youth movement on the right, spending time in a yeshiva, particularly in Israel for an extended period of time, or is it about things one does at home, coming from a kosher home, or celebrating Shabbat with your family on a regular basis? Which of these things has an impact on which elements of Jewishness, right? And this, as I said, we've done this a couple of times, and we found very similar results both times. And these are the results. And essentially, let me sort of run through them. I hope you can follow this. So you can see down the left different interventions, and you can see across the right of the chart these different dimensions of Jewishness. So if you go to synagogue classes, to Cheder, there was a question earlier about that, what type of Jewishness do we see lighting up, if you like, amongst that amongst people who go through that intervention. We see cultural observance. What was that? You're more likely, if you go through that intervention, to turn up at the family Seder or to fast on Yom Kippur, but to do these things really out of a sense of kind of cultural connection than anything else. If you go to a Jewish school, what are the things that light up there? Practical observance, that was like belonging to a synagogue, marking Shabbat in some way, having a kind of a strong Jewish circle, but not deeply believing in the way that I kind of mentioned with the mindful observance. And also survivalist action, that was about supporting Israel, combating anti-Semitism, being opposed to intermarriage in some way. Those things also seem to light up statistically when we look at this. Youth movement involvement, we see practical observance lighting up again. So that was kind of belonging to a synagogue, marking Shabbat in some way, social activity, and cultural observance as well, turning up for the family Seder, fasting on Yom Kippur, etc. Now, interestingly, and very controversially, by the way, we don't see anything light up when we look at youth movement summer camps and Israel summer tours. Now, I want to say more about that because that's a deeply challenging finding, I think, for many of us, including myself. But statistically, that's what we found, that when we isolate that particular intervention, we don't see a positive impact on any of those measures of identity. But contrast that with spending a year in a yeshiva, everything lights up. We see some impact on all of these dimensions. And spending time on a gap year program in Israel, everything except for the kind of the religious stuff lights up, interestingly. So that gap year, I guess, would be a non-religious program. But the other thing I think that's really important here is some of the home stuff. If you come from a family that has Shabbat dinner on a regular basis, everything lights up. If you come from a family where you observe kashrut in some way, shape or form, it doesn't even necessarily need to be strictly halakhic. Most things light up. Statistically, that's what we found, and we've done this analysis now of 2 different data sets and found pretty much exactly the same thing both times. A word of humility about all of this, and that is, before I get to word of humility. So if someone asked me what works on the basis of this type of analysis, like what works in terms of passing Jewishness onto the next generation, number one, it seems to me, is what happens in our homes. It's very difficult to influence that at a collective level, but it's very easy to influence it on an individual level. But what we do in our Jewish homes is really, really critical. And here it was measured by, as I said, Shabbat dinner, keeping a kosher home. Those things over time have a significant impact. I also mentioned, in terms of educational programming, long-term yeshiva programs in Israel, particularly, and long-term gap year programs, non-religious, I guess, gap year programs in Israel. So what are the factors? I've already mentioned home, but I think what's interesting about yeshiva programs and gap year programs is 3 different things that I think are important. One is that they're long-term experiences. These are not short, one-off, come out to a lecture for an evening, or even sort of 2-week, 3-week programs. They are long-term, several months, if not close to a year or more even. They are immersive. You are completely immersed in that Jewish environment, both in terms of the program, but also these programs are often in Israel, and being immersed in a Jewish society in Israel also seems to have a bearing. And the third piece I think that's also critical is the group, the collective, that by being part of a program where you're doing it with a group of friends, you are building a sense of community and collectivity, and from that you can expand that and you can develop it and you can build it for the rest of your life. So if you ask me in simple terms what this research says, those are the things that we see having the most significant impact. What we do at home and these sort of long-term immersive group programs are the most impactful things. I said a word of humility, and that is the following. When we try to assess the extent to which these different factors affect people's Jewish identity, and here we look at demographic variables like how old you are, whether you're male or female, upbringing variables, like the kind of home you come from, and Jewish educational program variables, different programs you've been on, and we look at them against each of these different dimensions of Jewishness, we can't explain, and the best case scenario we can explain about half of what's going on. There's an awful lot statistically that we don't understand. There's other stuff going on that we haven't quite figured out what it is or what to measure in order to pick it up. There's a lot about this that's complicated, a lot about this that is just unknown. And I want to finish with one, I think, important point about the Israel summer tours and the summer camps. I come from that world. I went on an Israel summer tour, I went on summer camps, I led them. So when I first saw these data, I was really pretty shocked and quite disturbed by it. But the more I've thought about it, the more I think that actually we often see our kids come off those programs feeling really infused and engaged and excited. But what these data say is that all of that's true. What these data say is that those programs, if we look at them on their own, they are not lighting up any of those different dimensions of Jewish identity. So does that mean you scrap them? It would be ludicrous to sort of even contemplate that. Because what I think this is ultimately pointing to is, like, all of those programs are important in different ways. Some of them are clearly more impactful than others. But I think those programs are really where we don't see any evidence of different dimensions of Jewishness lighting up. They're important on their own terms, and I think what they are is sort of stepping stones to engagement. How do you build a Jewish identity? I think it's about the cumulative effects of multiple different experiences. Those experiences are important in their own way, but if that's all you do, and that's what this research says, if you only send your child to an Israel tour or you only send your child to a summer camp, that's not going to do it in the way that if a child goes on a gap year program or if you grow up in an engaged Jewish home will do. They're simply not strong enough on their own terms alone to impact Jewishness. So that's what I can tell you about the work that we've done. As I said, it's incomplete. There's a lot more work to do on it. One of the things we're building at JPR is a monitoring and evaluation unit that's going to do a lot more work in this field. So I hope over the coming years we'll understand a lot more about this. But based on what we've done so far, this is part of our starting point.
Thank you. I was amongst a group of Jewish educators and community professionals who were at Court House, JPR's headquarters, 2 years ago, whenever it was, when John first presented this, and the room was full of people like me who had spent their whole career, not only had gone in person to all of these things and participated, but spent their careers training the madrachim, the youth leaders of these groups. And then someone like me who'd even, my master's thesis was all about the impact on Jewish identity of the Israel tour, and how I'd proven as a very bright 23-year-old, without doubt in my master's, that it was absolutely the peak experience. And we all sat in this room, and honestly, I've never heard a presentation that JPR have given where so many people went and sort of held each other. There was a kind of a communal gripping going on, and it took a lot more conversations with John, which we don't have the time for today, for people like me to get my head round what it said, because instinctively I wanted to say, no, you're wrong. Data can't be right, do it again. And I think one of the important things that you just explained there was about the example of the youth movement camp and the stepping stone. And I would argue, and there's other people in this room, I think, that have worked in that field in professional and lay leadership roles, that we won't get those numbers of young people. We know the numbers have shrunk of those who do these gap years in Israel, but almost every single one of them going on a gap year has come through a youth movement and done the Israel tour. So those stepping stones, if they weren't there, not only did they not have the impact they have, but the numbers of people doing those gap years would just drop. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely.
Does that make me feel slightly better?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Israel tour is probably like one of the most successful programs that we run, just like purely in numerical terms. So it's an important stepping stone. But what I'm saying here is, if that is all that one does, if we look at it in isolation from everything else, it's insufficient. It doesn't do it on its own. That doesn't mean it's not important. But if that's all you do, then you're not going to see the results.
I feel slightly more comforted about that. I want to ask you a question, then we're going to open up for probably a couple of questions, and then we'll start wrapping up. If I take that on face value, and you might have to disabuse me of my understanding here, would it not say to those that make policy, and again those who hold the purse strings in the community, that something, if we wanted to be radical in strengthening Jewish identity, that one of the things we might want to look at is, could there be a national programme to strengthen the volume, the number of people, and the quality of Friday night dinner experiences in people's homes? Mm-hmm. Just as a crazy, is that the kind of thing? Is that kind of thing suggested as a result?
I think one of them,
too literal.
No, not necessarily. I think it's very challenging and very difficult to influence what people do in their homes, because they're also, you bring your own life to that, and people have their own dynamics in their homes. It's much easier to build programs, and that's hard enough as it is. But yeah, I think what this says is what we do and what we do in our homes is really important. The example that we set our children or our grandchildren is a really, really critical piece of the jigsaw puzzle. And you can't rely on teachers, youth workers to do it for you. You have to take it seriously yourself and build that Jewish environment at home if you want this stuff to work. Are there, could the community invest in interventions to help that? Yes, of course. How? I think and there are all sorts of kind of, educational initiatives around family education that have been tried, particularly in the States. And there's, I think, plenty to learn from there. But it's not an easy environment to influence, because fundamentally, we all have our own dynamics at home.
And one of my concerns comes out of that, and it's something, again, just anecdotally, and I know anecdotes versus data is, I'm never going to win. But that feeling, the growth of Jewish schools, just bear with me on this, the growth of Jewish schools and the number of those families who, I'm going to call it, outsource the Jewish to the school, right? That's not everyone that goes to Jewish schools, of course, but there are people, and I'm sure plenty of people here know people like that, who there isn't much of the Jewish stuff going on at home, there isn't much of the Friday night dinner, there may or may not be a Seder, and Yom Kippur is a pain in the tuchus for these families. But they're absolutely determined their kids will go to Jewish school because they can do the Jewish there. And that's the bit that worries me most of all with this growth of, when I look at different bits of your data and I mash it together in my strange mind, and I worry about those people that are not, that cognitive dissonance of send my kid to a Jewish school, which isn't lighting up too many things there, but I tick the box of Jewish, but we're not doing it at home. And again, I'm not saying that's all the families that go to school, but that for me in the Venn diagram would seem to be where we have a problem.
Yeah. I think, again, I don't have the empirical evidence for this, but my hunch is that an important piece of this is about coherence. That, what one does in one's home and what one does within the school environment for kids and what one does within the community environment in terms of the synagogue, all of those are important. If those are coherent, if there are sort of similar messages coming out of all of them, then they reinforce one another. If there's dissonance between what one does at home and what one does at school, and people sort of feeling like, their parents are telling me that being Jewish is really, really important, but they're actually not doing it at home. And there are cases like that, and I'm not sure they're quite as prevalent as you're suggesting. Then I think that my hunch is that creates that creates a problem. There's a need for a degree of consistency for children as they grow up about what messages are you sending.
As long as Jewish doesn't become a subject like science or maths, right? Because we need to understand maths and we need to understand science, but actually living Jewishly is something that if it isn't happening at the home, we can see the impact.
I think, by the way, that's why the sort of long-term informal education programs are more impactful than schools, because in a long-term informal educational program, like a gap year program, everything you do, even stuff that's not part of the program, is in some way shaped by the context in which you're in. It's shaped by the group or by the context of Israel or whatever it is. Whereas in school, you're absolutely right. You know, most of the time you spend in a Jewish school, you're studying English or French or maths or science, and the Jewish studies piece is a piece of the curriculum. And often, and in some schools anyway, not in all, but in some schools, are not a particularly important part of the curriculum, because the really important stuff is, you know, the subjects that are going to get you into university, and the Jewish studies piece is not sufficiently important. So, you know, I think often that message is communicated in certain families, not obviously not so much in the majority, actually.
And none of yours, obviously. So let's open up. We're down to the last few minutes, so I'm going to take this lady with the glasses in the front row, and a gentleman who's tried a couple of times over the evening with the newspaper behind. Thank you.
Thank you. Really interested the whole evening. Really good. You can probably hear I'm from Israel. Originally, I came here many years ago when I was 25, so I'm longer here than there. What surprised me in this last few minutes is the notion that being Jewish is doing Jewish. I don't do any of that. I don't belong to a synagogue, neither in Israel nor here. I have a connection, obviously, with Israel. I work for a Jewish organization. I am Jewish. I always felt it, but it doesn't have to, for me, be anything that I do or that my children do. And I find the notion that if we don't, that we somehow have to get together to make sure that every Jew does the things that were on there, I find surprising.
I think the question there is, you know, how important is it to transmit that feeling of Jewishness that you have to the next generation, you know, whether it's to your own children or to, you know, children that you work with or grandchildren or whatever it is. If that's not particularly important, then none of this really matters. But I think what we're saying here is, if that is important, if this is something that one wants to transmit in a serious way, and wants their children or the children they're working with to grasp it and to learn to engage with it and ultimately to love it, and that rarely happens by osmosis. You have to put some effort into it, and I think there are different attitudes. Your attitude is entirely reasonable. If that's not particularly important, then fair enough. I guess I'm speaking to those who are really concerned about how do I ensure that the next generation have a strong, deep Jewish identity. And I think what this says is the stuff we do at home and the types of opportunities we offer our children, the types of groups that they're part of, the types of immersive opportunities they have, the amount of time they spend doing Jewish stuff, all has an impact. If we don't take that stuff seriously, then we shouldn't be surprised if our children don't end up with particularly strong or engaged Jewish identities.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, this in a way follows from the previous question. You ended by talking about how the data might help you to think about the future of the UK Jewish community. But you started with the census data. And on the census, you can only identify as a Jew. If you do it directly, you can only identify as a Jew by religion. You can, or certainly in the 2001, I think also in 2011, you can write in that you're a Jew ethnically, I think is the word they use. But there's nothing about culturally at all. Do you think it would be helpful in planning for the future to be able to identify as a Jew other than by religion in the census?
So we've had this conversation in the office for many years, and if we were having this conversation, say in 1998 when the planning was being done for the 2001 census, I would have said without any shadow of a doubt we should be looking for different ways of allowing Jews to count themselves in. Unfortunately, what happened in 2001 is, as you said, there was a religion question where you could tick the box, and there was a write-in option where you could, say you're ethnically Jewish. And the same thing happened in 2011. If in the 2021 census we were to change that in some way and give people different ways of identifying as Jewish, our capacity to compare what we found in 2021 with 2011 and 2001 would be, to all intents and purposes, destroyed. So In an ideal world, would there be different ways of measuring it in the census? Absolutely. Given where we are now, I don't think we have any choice. And actually the recommendation that we made to the Office for National Statistics, and I did it with a heavy heart, was to say, leave it alone. Because fundamentally what we want to use the census data for is not to count how many Jews there are. There are different ways of doing that. But it's really to track what's happening to the Jewish population. We know that there are, as you saw, about 270,000 Jews who identify by religion. Some of those also, by the way, identify by ethnicity, and there are more who write in they're Jewish by ethnicity who don't identify as Jews by religion. But it's a few thousand, 2,000-3,000, no more than that. So it's it's a complicated question, but we also know, by the way, that in Britain there are about 420,000 Jews who have at least one Jewish grandparent. So would be entitled to make Aliyah under the terms of the law of return. So there is a population out there that we're not picking up in the census. That may in some way be connected to the Jewish community. So the census isn't perfect. All of that said, it is by far and away the best data source that we have on Jews in Britain, and indeed, outside of Israel, probably the best data set that exists on Jews anywhere in the world. So beggars can't be choosers. We have to kind of work with what we have, and we're pretty lucky in this community to have what we do have. Not perfect, but it's bloody good.
That brings us round full circle to something I started saying, which is we are really incredibly lucky in this community. I grew up, as I said, as a Jewish educator, and certainly adhering to the belief that I'm only interested in qualitative data. I'm only interested in what people tell me they feel and what they think, because I'm an educator and I'm a youth movement person and that kind of thing. And what John and colleagues at JPR have really opened my eyes to is that actually the hard data that we're able to collect, and we can only collect what we're able to collect, obviously, but that which we can collect and that can be analysed at such the level that JPR are doing now is something that we as a community, I suspect most people don't really know about. You should do a survey on how many people know about that. There you go, that's for next year. But I think what we want to try and do more through events like this is to just open everyone's eyes a little bit. This is a little glimpse of a vast amount of data that you have, which I hope people have found interesting, challenging a little bit, entertaining a little bit. And what I hope you'll do is engage more. And what I tend to do is find most of your reports online on JPR's website. I suspect it's on the. Oh, there we go. There'll be a slide with it. There you go. I look forward to when I get those hard copies in the post. It gives me something to read and to fetch about and disagree with and argue about and ultimately be convinced by Daniel or Richard or John. But I really do encourage you, because these numbers, what we have now, is a richer source than I've ever seen in my career. And hopefully what they can do is help those of you in the room that are involved in planning, in policy, in funding, in running the community in some way, engage more and more in this. So I just want to say thank you to John and colleagues at JPR for partnering with us, and I hope that you'll join us the same time next year and just challenge him on anything he said that he's now gone against with the new stats. So
can I just
final word?
One final word. I just want to also just acknowledge my colleagues, but particularly Dr. Daniel Stetsky, who's in the audience here in the second row, who has been a colleague for many years and has done a lot of the work on these figures. We're fortunate to have a really quite extraordinary research team, and as well an operations team. Everyone has PhDs. Everyone's kind of spent years and years trying to study this stuff. I don't think what we have is a perfect picture at all, but what we're trying to do is exactly that: just generate, gather data, generate data, analyse data, try to look at what's going on through that empirical lens, so that community leaders and players have access to it and can use it to sort of inform their thinking. So I hope what we've done this evening is prompted some thoughts and some questions, and I would absolutely sort of encourage people to go to our website and feel free to download everything. We, as a matter of principle, put stuff out on our website so that people can do that. We are a registered charity, so if anybody wants to help us, you're very welcome to do that as well. And I also just wanted to finish by thanking Raymond and all of you for participating in the conversation and facilitating it. Really, really appreciate it.
Shout out to our